Welcome to Pacific States University's online lecture series for Gen 108, Explorations in the Arts. Today, we are diving into the two massive, overlapping movements that fundamentally changed the trajectory of modern culture, realism and naturalism. I'm so thrilled to be guiding you through this really critical juncture in both art and literary history. If you've ever sat back and wondered how on earth did we go from painting flawless Greek gods to, well, gritty, unvarnished depictions of everyday modern life, you are absolutely in the right place today. These two movements, which spanned roughly from 1830 to 1880, literally forced society to look in the mirror. So let's just jump right in.
Okay, here's a quick roadmap for today's lecture. We're going to start with Section 1, the rebellion against the ideal. Then we'll move into Section 2, realism and social reality. Section 3 shifts our focus over to naturalism and scientific observation. For Section 4, comparing realism and naturalism, we'll untangle those two confusing terms. And finally, in Section 5, we'll wrap up with the legacy of the movements.
All right, Section 1, rebellion against the ideal. Let's set the stage.
To really appreciate a good rebellion, you first kind of have to understand the establishment, right? I want you to picture walking into a major European art salon, or maybe opening up a mainstream novel right around the 1820s. You'd be completely bombarded. Grand historical battles, perfectly sculpted Greek mythological figures, sweeping, overly dramatic landscapes that were specifically designed to stir your soul. This was the undisputed reign of neoclassicism and romanticism. Art had a very specific job back then. It was supposed to elevate you with this perfectly idealized version of the past. But as we roll into the 1830s and 40s, a major shift happens. Artists and writers essentially looked out their windows and started asking some really profound questions. Like, why are we painting Venus when the streets of Paris are literally filled with poverty? Or why are we writing about medieval knights when the Industrial Revolution is fundamentally reshaping human existence right now? Notice on our timeline here the pivotal year at 1848. That was a year of sweeping political revolutions all across Europe, and it triggered a massive boom in realist art. Shortly after, in 1859, Charles Darwin publishes On the Origin of Species, which perfectly aligns with the scientific, analytical boom of naturalism. By the 1880s, the legacy of both of these movements was permanently cemented. Now, today, people use the words realism and naturalism interchangeably all the time, but historically speaking, they meant two very distinct things, and getting a handle on that distinction is absolutely crucial for this course. To break it down simply, realism was all about what was being looked at. It was an active choice to look at the ordinary, unvarnished truth of social reality, the workers, the poor, the wonderfully mundane. Naturalism, on the flip side, was about how it was being looked at. It was an approach rooted in objective, scientific detachment. It's like, imagine a biologist studying nature and human behavior through a microscope. Keep that baseline in mind as we start looking at the specific artists and writers from these eras.
Moving on to Section 2, realism and social reality. Let's see how these artists brought the everyday world to life. So, realism truly catches fire around the 1840s, driven by this burning social conscience, and really fueled by the social upheavals and working-class demands of those 1848 revolutions we just talked about. The core philosophy here was wildly revolutionary for the time. Art absolutely must depict ordinary people. Before this, if working-class folks ever made it onto a canvas at all, they were completely romanticized, portrayed as these happy, perfectly content peasants who just loved their difficult lives. Realism aggressively shattered that comfortable little illusion. The absolute undisputed champion of this movement was the bold French painter Gustave Courbet. He famously declared, "I cannot paint an angel because I've never seen one." Just think about how radical that statement is for a 19th century artist. No way was he going to conform. He's flat out rejecting centuries of deeply ingrained religious and mythological tradition. He's essentially telling the establishment, I'm only going to create art about what is tangibly, physically right in front of my own two eyes. And here is exactly how Courbet put that philosophy into practice. His 1849 masterpiece, The Stonebreakers. He depicts two men, one who frankly looks way too young to be doing this kind of manual labor, and one who looks way too old, just shattering rocks by the side of a dirt road to make gravel. Courbet doesn't give them heroic, noble expressions. In fact, he actually turns their faces away from us, making them completely anonymous. He uses these dirty, earthy tones and thick, rough paint that physically mirrors the grit of their exhausting work. But you know what the most shocking element was? Courbet painted this everyday, mundane scene on a massive canvas. At the time, that kind of huge physical scale was strictly reserved for kings, popes, or grand historic battles. By doing this, Courbet was making a massive, undeniably political statement. The anonymous, exhausted laborer is just as worthy of monumental art as a king. Now, this revolution wasn't just happening with paint. It spread like wildfire through literature, too. Writers like Honoré de Balzac and Gustave Flaubert over in France, or George Eliot in England, they used their pens exactly the way Courbet used his brush. Take Flaubert's classic, Madame Bovary. Flaubert didn't write about some grand, tragic heroine saving a nation. No, he wrote about a deeply flawed, terribly bored provincial woman who was just trapped by her incredibly mundane middle-class reality. And it was a massive scandal. Why? Because it held up an unvarnished mirror to the middle class and forced them to look at their own unglamorous reflection. So if we want to distill the crucial takeaways for realism, we can summarize them right here. First, a strict focus on the present. Realists completely rejected historical or mythological nostalgia. Second, democratic subjects. They elevated peasants, urban workers, sex workers, and the mundane middle class to the status of primary artistic subjects. And third, the unvarnished truth. They absolutely insisted on showing the dirt under the fingernails, the deep wrinkles of age, and the harsh socioeconomic struggles without a single ounce of sugarcoating. Let's shift gears now to Section 3, Naturalism and Scientific Observation.
Okay, so while realism was heavily focused on the social sphere, naturalism, which, remember, started evolving a bit earlier in the 1830s with the Barbizon School, was driven by a strict, almost clinical scientific impulse. The mid-19th century was the dawn of a massive new age of science. Industrialization was booming, photography was just invented, and suddenly the whole world demanded data, close observation, and empirical proof. Naturalist painters decided that art should operate basically like a laboratory. They completely abandoned their perfectly controlled indoor studios and went outside into the unpredictable open air, what the French famously called painting en plein air. Artists like Jules Bastien Lepage and Jean-François Millet, they wanted to study exactly how light actually hit a field of wheat at, say, 2 p.m. on a random Tuesday. They threw out the artificial, dramatic, golden lighting of the old masters. If the sky in rural France was gray and totally overcast, they painted it gray and totally overcast. They studied anatomy, botany, and atmospheric conditions with a rigorous, unapologetic precision.
Over in the literary world, naturalism took an even sharper scientific turn. The absolute spearhead of this was the French writer Émile Zola. Zola didn't just view himself as a storyteller, he honestly viewed himself as a literal scientist, conducting a rigorous experiment right there on the page. He was a firm believer in environmental determinism. That's the idea that human beings are entirely shaped by two inescapable forces, their heredity and their environment. In his novels, Zola would take characters from very specific biological backgrounds and drop them into incredibly harsh environments, like a grueling, highly dangerous coal mine or the absolute darkest slums of Paris. And then he would clinically document how they degraded, turned to vice, or simply struggled to survive. It was cold, it was clinical, and the level of detail was just incredibly intense. Summarizing naturalism, we can see a really distinct shift away from the realist agenda. First, we have objectivity. The artist or author attempts to be a completely neutral observer, deliberately stripping out their own emotional bias or moral judgment. Second is determinism. This is that core, somewhat bleak belief that human beings are shaped by their biology and social environment and are very often powerless against the massive, grinding gears of nature or society. And finally, an eye for nature. This is an obsessive, deeply scientific dedication to rendering the physical world, the light and the landscape exactly as the human eye perceives them. Section 4. Comparing realism and naturalism. Let's do a quick side-by-side analysis to really clear things up.
Both visually and textually, these two movements can look incredibly similar at first glance. So how do we actually draw the line between them? Let's break it down. Look at the core focus. Realism is obsessed with social classes and political reality. Naturalism, on the other hand, is obsessed with nature, environment, and human instinct. Next, check out the underlying tone. Realism almost always carries some kind of political or social critique. It wants to point out injustice, even if it's subtle. Naturalism strives to be purely clinical, detached, and scientifically objective. It just wants to give you the data. But the biggest difference? Their view of humanity. In realism, humans still have agency. Yes, they are navigating a highly flawed social structure, but they are still actively making choices. In naturalism, humans are largely viewed as tragic victims of their environment or their biological fate.
To make this perfectly clear, let's try a little thought experiment together. I want you to imagine a crowded, miserable, third-class train carriage, okay? If a realist painter approaches the scene, they're going to paint that carriage to really emphasize the stark divide between the wealthy folks up in first class and the struggling folks in third class. It's a deliberate social critique. But if a naturalist writer or painter approaches that exact same carriage, they are going to analyze how the terrible air ventilation, the painfully cramped physical space, and the biological stress of the passengers mathematically lead to altered human behavior. Same exact subject, but entirely different tools used to unmask the present. Make sense, right?
Finally, let's wrap up with Section 5, the legacy of the movements.
By the time we reached the 1880s, the dust was starting to settle, but the art world, and honestly how humanity fundamentally viewed itself, had changed forever. These weren't just passing stylistic fads, you guys. They were massive shifts in the very purpose of art. We had permanently moved beyond the studio and into the streets, the fields, and the slums. And the distinct legacies of each movement are just profound. Step 1. Realism's uncompromising dedication to social truth laid the direct groundwork for modern documentary photography, gritty street art, and those intense contemporary dramas we still watch today on stage and screen. I mean, without Courbet breaking the rules, we probably don't get the socially conscious photojournalism of the 20th century. Step 2, naturalism's absolute obsession with accurate light and going outside, that whole en plein air foundation we talked about, that provided the exact technical stepping stones a young group of art rebels needed. That group would eventually become known as the Impressionists, and they would launch an entirely new artistic revolution based precisely on those early naturalist studies of light and atmosphere. So as we wrap up today's lecture, I really want to leave you with this final thought. What profound beauty and deep tragedy can we discover when we finally unmask the ordinary world? Realism and naturalism forced humanity to look right into a mirror without any flattering filters. They proved unequivocally that there is immense value, power, and truly high art in the perfectly ordinary world right in front of us. Thank you all so much for joining me for this session of Gen 108. I genuinely hope that the next time you look at a gritty novel or a landscape painting, you see it with a completely new set of eyes. Have a wonderful week, everyone, and I'll see you in our next lecture.